Hey y'all, we're back. So, back with time restricted feeding,
Right.
and this time we're going to talk a little bit about research. So, I don't know why I did this either. Research.
Getting technical.
We are so cool. So, like we talked about in the last one, Dr. Satchin Panda is pretty much the head researcher on this. And that's where we learned a lot about time restricted feeding in general. So again, we will link the podcasts here because I feel like it's a really good, if you don't want to read research or understand it or don't want to, him and Rhonda have a really good conversation. And I mean, it's pretty long, but both podcasts are long. So we'll link that there. But let's talk about like your favorite study from him.
Right. So my favorite study that I came across was basically when he proved that like food does affect your metabolism, because your metabolism is temporal, right? We are diurnal animals as humans. We are up and around and we are doing activities during the day, and we sleep and rest and recover at night. So in a study that he did, he basically wanted to see whether or not food would alter the way certain metabolic regulations were changed. So basically what he did was he took two groups of mice. One group was able to eat all day whenever they wanted. Well, mice are nocturnal.
Sign me up.
So all night, whenever they wanted. Yes. And then the other group was restricted to 12 hours of feeding. They were only allowed to eat during the 12 hours that they were awake, and which for mice, since they're nocturnal, is at night.
But it was still ad libitum, right?
Yeah, so anytime during those 12 hours ad lib. They both had the same exact calorie amount as well. So they controlled that as well.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying? So both were eating the same exact amount of calories, the same macronutrient breakdown, it was an obesogenic diet, so high carb, high fat. And then they just did an extra group, which were restricted to 9 hours of feeding, and then obviously like 14 hours of fasting. And they found that in the group that was restricted to 12 hours of eating compared to the group that was eating the same exact amount, the same type of food, all day long whenever they wanted, compared to them, the time-restricted feeding group had obviously decreases in fat mass, increases somehow in lean muscle mass, improved insulin sensitivity, lowered blood glucose, lower inflammation, and then strangely enough, for whatever reason, higher mitochondrial volume in like the time-restricted feeding groups. In the 9-hour feeding group, they found that those mice actually had improved like endurance. Like,
I remember that.
Endurance.
I was like, the insulin sensitivity thing is huge,
Right.
I think.
Yeah, and that's super important, like
Even
especially
with
if you're diabetic.
The same macronutrient
Yeah.
breakdown. That was the study that they were talking about, that I was like, okay, I need to do this, because you're eating the same amount as you would be. You're just changing the times and you're getting more benefit. So it's like,
and both were like obesogenic diets. They were like high carb, high fat, same amount of calories, but the only difference was the time. Yeah.
We wouldn't recommend an obesogenic diet, besides the holidays, which are kind of wrapping up right now, which has been super obesogenic.
Yeah.
But for most people, like, you're not going to be doing that, like all the time. But even if you are, it seems like there are benefits here, which is pretty crazy. And I see even with healthy people who compete, they can run into insulin sensitivity issues.
Right.
And this just seems to happen for whatever reason. Like, maybe people are predisposed. It might have something to do, obviously, with like the, eating, like, chronic restriction, and then eating a lot for, after the show, this and that. But not even that. Like, some people are just more susceptible to it. And some of my clients, like, can literally eat so much all the time and they're totally fine. And then other people, that kind of just starts to creep out of control, and then you're like, hey, we need to kind of dial this back in. So something like the time restricted feeding, and even just fasting in general, can obviously help a ton with blood glucose and your insulin sensitivity.
So your metabolism is temporal, and the time that you eat is important, because your body has to do things at certain times, and like feed at certain times, and then recover and rest and build at certain times.
And that really ties into what we were talking about with the sleep. And when you're like, their sleep is so important for certain things, like clearing out like the amyloid plaque, and then restoring memories, and like doing all these things like in your brain, and like your body needs this to function properly. And if you have things that are possibly hindering it, you're not going to get the best you know, bang for your buck every time you go to sleep. And even though you might be in bed for a certain amount of hours, it doesn't necessarily mean that you got like the quality sleep. And understandable, like, listen, like, I get it, like, we have lives and like shit happens. It's not like we can like eat perfectly every day and like whatever, but this is just another tool to use. Like, hey, I'm gonna try and structure my day to eat within 10 to 12 hours, you know, or eat within 10 hours and, you know, drink other things within 12 hours, however you want to look at it, and use this kind of as a tool to manage your health. Because of course, calories, like we said, calories are important, micronutrients are important, and all these things kind of go together. Like, you can't just say, like, I don't know, like, I feel like people really have thrown like health away. Yeah,
there are like camps where it's like calories don't matter, like when you eat doesn't matter, like where you put your carbs during the day doesn't matter.
Yeah, and you could look to, there's literally research for everything, and the research that shows obviously how many calories you eat is probably the most potent, right? Like, that is pretty much the biggest potential for like long-term problems, right? Like, if you're overeating, over-consuming an obesogenic diet, that's going to lead to the most problems. Plain and simple. There's no arguing that. But once you have that under control, there are other things to look at, like the types of foods that you eat, when you eat, you know, how you're training, how you're sleeping, like all these things go together. And that's why it's just important to learn more about these like nuances if you're already like past that level. I think like there's levels to everything. If you're somebody who's just like wildly overeating or doesn't really, or eating some days like a little bit and then lots of the other days and kind of go up and down, you know, reining that in is really important. But then once you have gotten that under control, I think it's really important to look at these other things. And time restricted feeding just happens to be a pretty easy thing to implement. And it has a lot of benefits. So like, it's not really hard. There's not really a good cost to entry besides just kind of like knowing when you're eating, and you're good to go from there. And for the next video, we're going to talk about the practical implications of this, because, you know, obviously there is a lot of cool science, but, you know, we live this and coach this. So I think it's important to talk about actually how to implement this, because there is so much different data and like camps out there. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you liked that. And yeah, next one coming up.